Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and we have a great program lined up for you, and it's all about the prosperity part of our business model, because being able to pay your bills leads to the freedom that we all want to observe. Joining us from the Heartland Institute, senior managing editor there is Sterling Burnett, and he's got a great recent article about Russian meddling in our energy market. We hear Russian meddling all the time. Sterling, welcome to the program, and you've unearthed where it really is happening. Thank you for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me on.
So we watched the collapse of the wall, and all of that went on, and of course there was that self-congratulatory moment of, quote, winning the Cold War. But then as the Russian economy collapsed, Putin especially artful at rebuilding it based around the natural gas they were able to find and using energy as their source of any sort of economic stability whatsoever. But they've gone beyond that, haven't they?
Well, yeah. I mean, energy is, I think 70% of the Russian government's revenue comes from their energy production, and that's primarily exports. Mm-hmm. They export the oil around the world, and they export the natural gas largely to Europe. And every year, if Europe objects to their interference in Georgia or an interference in Ukraine or any of their other geopolitical aspirations, Russia threatens to cut off the natural gas, and they have on occasion, and that leaves Europe sort of shivering in the dark during the winter, or in the cold during the winter. Mm-hmm. So Putin has been very adept at leveraging Russia's natural resources for geopolitical power. And what we found out, this new report from the House Science Committee, mm-hmm. found that Russia, and Russia's interfering. Whatever they say about interfering in our elections, and we'll find all that out, we know they've interfered in our energy markets. They've attempted to disrupt U.S. energy markets because we are directly competing with them. Right now we're building natural gas export terminals where we're sending gas around the world, but Europe is clamoring for it so they can get out from under Russia's thumb. Our gas is cheaper than theirs.
Yeah.
And
that's a great threat to Russia geopolitically, because that has been their only authority without the Red Army or anything else that they used to have to count on to reach out and to build an empire of resources that they don't necessarily have on their own, just as the Russian Republic.
Yeah, well, that's right. And so they set up over 4,300 or so accounts on Twitter, on Instagram, mm-hmm. on Facebook, where they would send out messages. They sent out in 2 years, so from 2015 through 2017, going just after the election, they sent out over 9,000 tweets, Instagram posts, Facebook posts, basically encouraging people to join protests against pipelines, for instance, in the U.S., mm-hmm. to show up at protests, to start new protests, to write their congressman saying, stop the drilling. Basically, they funded and supported the Keep It in the Ground movement that's been going on around this mm-hmm. country, where environmental groups, environmental lobbyists have been fighting to stop oil and gas production, fracking around the country, natural gas pipelines, oil pipelines, the Dakota Access Pipeline, all the protests mm-hmm. you saw. Well, Russia was encouraging them through their fake Twitter, Facebook, Instagram accounts. Russia was saying, get out there. And, they were supposed to be for Americans. These are fake accounts. They're all run by one organization out of St. Petersburg.
This is the IRA.
4,000 supposed American accounts, people over here saying, hey, I'm Joe Blow. Go to Dakota Access. They're killing the earth. Help us stop this terrible rape of the earth. Stuff like that.
In Sterling, we found this at the beginning of here in Virginia, that we have a couple of these pipelines, and the first protests seemed to baffle me because it was groups like the Sierra Club and the Nature Conservancy talking about property rights. And I said the next time the Sierra Club fights for somebody's property ownership rights will be the first time. But it seems like that was, and maybe that's where that discord came from, as it was from the Internet Research Agency, the one, and actually the first time I ever heard of them was a story about how they faked an entire news cycle about an explosion at some natural gas plant in New Orleans.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what they got away with. And the thing is, the thing that's amazing to me about it is not that the Russians do it, because you expect Putin to be doing stuff like this. I was surprised to hear that he might be meddling in our elections. No, he meddled in elections all over the world. He's interfered in elections. This is what the Russians do. To be honest, America doesn't have clean hands in elections around the world or in governments around the world historically, if you look around. Governments try and get people in power that are going to help them, and Russia's no different in that regard.
And one could argue that meddling in elections is better than proxy wars, but it is something you're right that it happens. You want friendly ears on the ground. We even saw this back through Vietnam and that era.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, we assassinated somebody when we didn't like them.
Right.
We wanted our friends in power, and so we sent in troops or we assassinated. Russia did something that we don't like, and they shouldn't be doing it, and we should be stopping it to the extent possible. But they're also interfering in our domestic and international policy in other ways, and the media is dead silent about it. You don't see news stories, except in a very few online outlets. New York Times should be running this on the front page, and they're not. They're silent. Why? Because they're collaborating with environmentalists on this Keep It in the Ground movement. They support this anti-fossil fuel agenda, and it's shocking. And the thing is, it goes beyond just Twitter posts. It goes beyond Facebook posts, encouraging protests. It turns out that they have been, through surrogates, funding some of these protests and movements. They've been sending money, millions of dollars, to environmental groups to support their cause, because they are undermining U.S. economic security, and that's in Russia's interest. So this is one of these things where you got this odd coalition of bedfellows of environmentalists and Russians working together to undermine U.S. energy independence.
And the environmental groups may have their own best interests, their own agendas, but they're getting this money. Do they realize where it's coming from? Do they not care where it's coming from, Sterling?
That's a question I can't answer. I don't know what's in their minds. I don't know what their books say about what they know about where they came from. It's not as if the Russian government, it's not as if Putin called them up and cut them a check. He did it through backdoor channels, through offshore accounts and things. So it's not clear what they know. It is clear that they've accepted the money and they've used it, and it's been used to support their protest. It's amazing. It was around 90 posts a day they were putting on these Twitter accounts protesting U.S. energy policy.
Well, is this something that is the danger of pure democracy? We talk about the representative republic that the country was set up as. That when you see countries where popular opinion outweighs the public interest in a lot of cases, especially in these direct democracies, this is the kind of crowdsourcing that you become guilty of having to have just to get something passed. Is well, we have to have a mob of people standing outside this pipeline. We don't know why, but we're just told to stand here because it's clean.
Yeah, well, I find I have a hard time calling that democracy. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying that
democracy means voting. It's not mobocracy. It's not called mobocracy. It's not called protestocracy. Protest may be a way of expressing yourself, but that in itself is not democracy. Democracy is voting on policies, and we don't have a democracy in the U.S. We have a representative, a Republican form of government that sets up that protects the rights of individuals against government
and against the mob
and against criminals and foreign interests, foreign powers. but limits the role of democracy through a constitution to protect minorities and to protect property rights and to protect individuals' interests and rights. So there is a realm of democracy within our constitutional republic that we vote. It's a representative democracy. We vote on people to represent us. And that's how it works here. Showing up at a flash mob or destroying a pipeline, that's not democracy.
Oh, God, no. It's Banana Republic. Sterling Burnett, Senior Fellow at the Heartland Institute, as author of a great piece that I believe we have up on our social media account regarding this very story, the Russian meddling, the real Russian meddling, and it's in our energy markets. And it really comes, as your story points out, when we realized out of the Dakotas and other areas of fracking, Pennsylvania, that we could actually become a net exporter, which 10 years ago seemed like science fiction, Sterling, but in a very short period of time, the United States has become energy independent and then some.
Fracking, it truly was a revolution. It has been a miraculous change in U.S. energy fortunes. Just like you say, just a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, I remember when natural gas was going for $14 and $12 per million cubic feet.
Wow.
Well, now it's $2 and something per million cubic feet. I remember when we were talking about we had 60 years of natural gas reserves less. Well, now it's well over 100 that we know of. So
that we know of.
It's changed the world as we know it, and it's made the U.S. A global player on energy, able to help our allies through our natural gas and oil supplies. Because remember, we're using fracking and horizontal drilling to produce more oil than we ever have before. We set records in November for oil production.
Yep.
It's amazing.
And you mentioned out helping our allies. You know, there was some of the countries like United Kingdom and Israel that don't have that natural resource. They would be hostages of the Russian government as well.
Well, they are, and that's the point. Is they're begging us to build more natural gas export terminals, so we can get them out from under Russia's thumb. And Russia can't stand this. It undermines their economy because they are so dependent on natural gas and oil exports for their revenue. So it's not surprising that Russia's doing it. It's just surprising that we aren't, that the American public isn't more aware of this. You know, this report is not the first time it's been noticed. Even Democrats notice this. Ben Cardin, a senator from Maryland, like I said, Democrat, he put out a report last year, and he called environmentalists useful idiots. That's his quote, useful idiots, for the way they had helped Russia undermine our energy interests. Because they've been over protesting in Europe. And you know, like I said, this isn't just here. They're doing this in Europe, setting up these fake accounts, fighting as England has tried to bring fracking online to produce natural gas there. They're over there getting ginning up protests. Don't get me wrong. It's not as if everyone that's protesting there wouldn't be there if it were not for the Russians. That's not true. You do have people, you know, in the U.S. that don't want fracking. You do have people in Europe that don't want fracking. But how big would the protests have been? How influential would they have been had the Russians not hyped them? Well, 90 to 100 posts a day, for instance.
Well, and that's the thing, you know, I mentioned kind of that mob rule we were talking about. We have politicians that base their opinions, their voting sometimes on these issues based on the crowds in their districts. And that, along with, and having been in broadcasting for 30 years, I know nothing draws a crowd like a crowd. We see organizations that have been around for decades rent a crowds anyway. You get a nice check from an oligarch somewhere that wants you to get a crowd going. What is renting 50 people just to get the starter of a crowd, and then 50 more people come by just to see what's going on, and all of a sudden you look like you've got a pretty serious protest going there, and none of it is based in anything genuine.
Yeah, well, it's like I said, it's shocking but not surprising.
Sterling,
Russia's doing this. What's surprising is how environmental groups have become dupes for the Russian government, and how the media is not pointing that out.
Sterling Burnett, senior fellow managing editor at the Heartland Institute. Is it the same as you mentioned just then about the energy groups, the green groups that have become these useful idiots that Ben Cardin called them? Is it the same as the anti-war groups in the Vietnam era that were taking Russian KGB money? Once the Soviet Union fell, we found out that the KGB was sending more money to the American anti-war protesters than they were to the Viet Cong. So, so it's not new if you know about it. I mean, is there some criminality? I guess that's where I'm going with this. Is what do we do about it?
Well, I've got no idea. I'm not a lawyer. Mm-hmm. I'm not in the criminal.
But is that a fair question to ask?
Justice system. So I just don't know whether laws were broken. I'm sure these accounts have been shut down. They've discovered them. They've been exposed. I'm sure they've been shut down. It's part and parcel of Russia's interference in U.S. Domestic policy, and that goes from the elections to energy policy to, I'm sure we will find. Over time, many other policy initiatives, international issues. Maybe Russia set up fake accounts to undermine our support for Israel, or to undermine our efforts in the war on terrorism. I'm sure we'll find that, and as soon as they find them, I'm sure they shut them down. But it's not hard to set up a Twitter account. It's not hard to set up a Facebook account. Yeah. So I'm sure that as soon as we're shutting them down, Russia, through other organizations that haven't been discovered yet, are doing others.
Should there be, and I know that your expertise goes back, you've worked in the environment and the energy creation world for some time. So I'm just asking as a conversation point, it's just two guys chatting on a weekend morning, that we watch Mark Zuckerberg saying, please regulate me. And the hairs on the back of my neck go up because, of course, he wants to be regulated so that he'll keep any future Facebooks from starting up. But that notwithstanding, are there rules that could be in place that make Twitter and or Facebook verify who's starting these accounts so that one guy can't have 18 Facebook pages or 25 Twitter accounts or anything like that?
I just don't know. I don't know enough about technology issues to know what rules are in place for things like that.
Then what it seems like we need to make sure that our elected officials that make these decisions, whether they be the appointees at EPA and the folks who work with Scott Pruitt or elected office holders in Congress, understand that these crowds and what we're doing here then blow the trumpet about all this happening. Is that what really you think should happen more of? Is more of this conversation so that Congress people are aware of what's going on?
Certainly, just because they get a post from Facebook on their website, mm-hmm. a congressperson or someone in the administration, just because an email comes in, they shouldn't necessarily assume that it's from a legitimate source. It's from someone in America with America's best interest in mind. I think that's one thing that it does show, that if you run a Twitter account and suddenly you're getting all these Twitter feeds saying, do this on U.S. energy, or probably, like I said, a range of other things, agriculture policy, who knows. The congressman shouldn't assume suddenly there's an upswell in his district mm-hmm. Against X policy or in favor of Y policy. He should be more circumspect. Mm-hmm. And he should look at what's good for the country vis-a-vis what's constitutional, what is good for the country, for people's rights, and what's good for the economy, not what's popular in the latest crowdfunding or crowdsourced protest.
One last one for you. Is there a concern from a public policy standpoint that between guys like Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg and George Soros, who are already invested in Steyer, especially in the anti-American energy movement and subsidize the sun and the wind farms, along with them and the Russian meddling, you could see elections were going into this, quote, midterm election where people will win seats wholly funded by campaign finance given through these organizations. I know there are federal prohibitions about foreign money coming into campaign contributions, but if they go through and they get laundered in the right way, are we equipped to even handle that kind of idea?
Gosh, it's just something I don't know. It's a legitimate concern. It's a really serious concern. Soros, everyone's talking about Steyer, but Soros has been doing this for decades.
Mm-hmm.
He's an expert at this. Now in Europe, they're shutting him down. They're literally saying, I'm sorry, we're shutting down this nonprofit organization. It turns out it's 90% funded by Soros, and it's out there buying newspaper space.
Really?
So these guys have been doing this. They're very adept, and technology moves so fast. It's hard to, you're always a step behind.
Mm-hmm.
There really is a danger. It's a legitimate danger that outside interest, and not just Russian interest, like you say. Tom Steyer, we know, is funding a referendum, a constitutional amendment in Colorado, trying to get them to adopt 50% renewable energy by 2030. Now, they've already rejected one of these before. The legislature has rejected this, but he's got the money and he's coming in again and he's trying to get them to adopt this. So it's one of those things. Is the media needs to be on the ball. That we have they're supposed to be they're supposed to be the fourth estate, not part of the deep state. So they should be exposing every time some millionaire. And I don't care if it's right or left.
Mm-hmm.
They always complain about the coach. When it's someone from the right that helps fund something,
sure,
they're all over it. But when it's someone from the left, the silence is deafening. And they need to be out there saying, look, this guy from California that's going to profit, by the way, he's going to profit from this referendum if it goes through. He made his billions, a lot of it from coal. So he's sort of talking out of two sides of his face here.
Sure.
Yeah. And you should know that he's not living in Colorado. He's not going to be affected by this. His energy prices aren't going to go up if this passes. It's yours that will. And you should be aware what his referendum's impact is going to have on you, the harm it's going to do.
You mentioned the deep state, Sterling, and is this the impact of the more government tries to regulate our marketplaces? And certainly, we want to make sure there are rules in place if somebody is a polluter, but we've created such a regulatory monolith that it gives that government agency the authority to kind of shut down some businesses and start up others. It seems patently outside of the realm of what our government was designed to do in the first place.
I've read my Constitution a number of times. I don't see in there at all. I don't see the word energy policy or energy does not exist. Yeah. It's not there.
That's right.
I don't see where the government's given the power to dictate what forms of energy people should be using. Governments. I don't see where in the Constitution where it says government should be funding certain industries through subsidies, through tax breaks.
Right.
So Steyer not only profits, and people like Steyer, Jay Faison, others, not only profit when governments mandate that a certain percent of their energy come from renewable energy because they are builders of this renewable energy. They profit from the subsidies that are given, and so they profit that the more states, governments' hands are bound, whether it's through a constitutional amendment or whether they can get the legislature to expand the renewable mandates, they call them portfolio standards. They profit from this, and we should be aware of that. We should recognize that these guys that are supposedly fighting for your interests, that are above the, I'm just concerned about the earth. Well, really, how much money will you make if this goes into effect? How will it hurt your competition?
Yep.
Because a lot of times it helps them by hurting their competition. None of this protectionist legislation is covered in the Constitution. This is stuff that's grown up that the courts have acquiesced to, and it's a shame. And it hurts. It hurts property rights. It hurts consumers. It hurts our markets. and it hurts us competitively overseas. And as far as I can tell, this is just as you say. The more government expands its role, the more it grows, whether it's in the economy, in personal lives, whatever, the less freedom we have, and the less we can be sure our interest, individual interest, our desires are being allowed that we're being allowed to flourish.
Well, and Sterling, certainly even then, if they were, if we had pristine water that we could drink right out of the river, I would say, okay, maybe we've done something, but we haven't even established that. So I do appreciate your time from the Heartland Institute. Sterling Burnett, thank you so much for your time this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thanks for having me on, and look for our work, and come get me again if you need me.
Absolutely. Anytime, absolutely. I mean, you don't tell me that, I'll start calling all the time. Coming up next, Tax Week continues. Where do all those tax dollars go? It seems like some of them go to Tom Steyer. We'll be right back on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Our next segment is on where do your tax dollars go. Justin Bogie is on with us this morning, and he is Senior Policy Analyst in Fiscal Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Justin, thanks for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Not at all, and thank you for everything everyone does at the Heritage Foundation, an amazing organization of folks that have really been at the avant-garde of it and still, to this day, are. Our last segment was about rent-seeking in the energy markets and Russia's meddling in those markets, and I just was struck by something an old friend of mine said. He said that rent-seeking is the world's second oldest profession, and it's very similar to the first. And we look at how much of our tax money goes into things that the Constitution does nothing towards mandating. Just a hand sketch. I know a lot of us talk about the legacy programs, the Social Security, the entitlement programs and reform there, but how much could we save if we just stopped spending money that the Constitution does not ask us to spend?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, the first two that you talked about, the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those are really the big spenders. Mm-hmm. But, about 30% or so of our budget is spent on these so-called discretionary programs. That's things like the national defense is about half of that, and then the rest are just kind of everything else that the federal government does. So, Department of Education, Department of Energy, pretty much every major federal agency is funded with the rest of that money. So there's any number of things that could be cut out of that. We put forth a budget here at Heritage every year. Our own proposal, we called for about $87 billion or so in cuts that could be made in 2018. So that's not a huge portion of the discretionary budget, but it is kind of a good start and a way to start paying down our debt and making an impact. Over the long term, you got to talk about the big programs, but sure. There's certainly a lot of waste and duplication that we could talk about in that kind of 15% or so of the federal budget.
Well, and I remember a Congressional Budget Office report somewhere about midpoint of the Obama administration. It was shortly after the 2010 Tea Party wave, and the CBO came out with a report that there were I'm tempted to say it was either 10 or $100 billion worth of programs that were completely 100% redundant to another program, and that money could be cut without impacting a single solitary soul because somebody else was already doing whatever that department was scheduled to do, and you just would have had to pick one over the other. And I think they even picked the smaller of all the agencies where redundancy was the key to it. So between those two things, if we just started that track, even without talking about reform for some of the programs like Social Security, we could start a track towards balancing the budget even without that reform.
Yeah, you're right. You could definitely kind of start getting on the right track. And CBO and the Government Accountability Office, they put out a duplication report or kind of like a high risk program report every year, where they identify areas where the federal government is overlapping or not being efficient. Those types of things. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people in Congress are taking the time to read those reports clearly because they're not really adopting their recommendations or doing anything about it to limit spending. But certainly, if we did make those reforms, if we cut out waste and fraud in Social Security and Medicare, not really making fundamental reforms, that's a tremendous amount of money every year that's going out the door for that kind of thing. So there certainly are ways to start making those reforms. I don't know that you can ever balance the budget on the long term with just getting to those kind of things. But it's certainly a good start and would be, first and foremost, a much better use of taxpayer money.
You don't have to be a character in the West Wing, though, to know that Social Security reform is the third rail of politics. It immediately becomes Congressman or Senator X is going to throw grandma from the train and we're going to renege on the promises that we've made to you. So how do we get to a place where we can actually have an honest debate about Social Security reform? And I get it. I understand. If somebody told me, hey, you're going to have to wait a few more years to tap into your Social Security, I might say if I didn't do what I do every day for a living, I might get inflamed about that, saying, hold on a second here. I was counting on retiring at 65.
I certainly understand that. Someone who also pays into the system, and when you're paying into it, you expect it to be there someday. But the reality of the situation is that on its current path, it's not sustainable. The trustees of the Social Security and Trust Fund has said that it will go insolvent by 2034, which really may sound like a long way away, but it's really not in the grand scheme of things. At that point, everybody's going to have to take a 23% cut. That's the estimate right now. So what do we do to avoid that? And the longer we wait to start talking about reforms and really having a conversation about it, the more dire that situation becomes, and we may be talking about bigger cuts in the future. And really, the only alternative to that will probably be more taxes, or really seeing even greater cuts to these discretionary programs than we would if we started now.
Well, let me ask you this, because last week we were talking about our rich states, poor states report, and Medicaid expansion being one of those. Here in Virginia, they're talking about it, but the House Management Budget Office said, we're not going to be sending that money to you that the Obama administration promised. It was going to be 100%, then it was 95%, then it was 90%, and as many of us in the commentariat predicted, eventually that would go away altogether. So you're really looking at a place where some of these entitlements are going to be thrown on states that can ill afford it already.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough situation, and I don't think anyone expects healthcare costs to go down in the next decade. It's only going to become more and more expensive for states and the federal government. So there's certainly that kind of tension there that we're going to have to address at some point. But again, if we don't start looking for solutions, if we don't really start having a more open and honest conversation about this, then they may not be there for anyone down the road. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an even bigger risk.
Yeah, that's the boogeyman in the room versus the fake boogeyman in it. Does the existence of Medicaid, Medicare, and the socialization, the federal subsidization of healthcare costs help or hurt? I've always been of the belief that if you subsidize something, it's just naturally going to become more expensive. We've seen it with college tuitions, and we're watching it with healthcare costs as well, because like governments and government unions, there's no I can't charge anymore, because there's this idea that there's always more, so I can just raise my prices again because they'll just go get more money for it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We've seen that with all of these programs that you're listing off. The cost of college loans, of a college education, has become more and more expensive, and has made it really hard for a lot of people to even go to school. The same thing, when Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid came around, decades ago, I don't know if if the people creating the programs could foresee that their costs would get so high over the long term. But that's I don't think insurance companies are going to decide to charge less all of a sudden, or doctors will start to charge less. So it's really a big concern.
Well, and when there's a finite amount of money coming out of Washington, finally, but deeper than that, it also impacts this deficit we continue to spend every time we print money to fund our debt. And for all those who, I'm not overstating this, the largest holder of American debt is actually the Social Security Administration, isn't it, Justin?
Yeah, if you include debt held by trust funds, the largest foreign holding of our debt is actually China, which isn't a whole lot more comforting. China and Japan, and I'm really glad you hit on that, because that is something we should all be concerned about. We're already spending several $100 billion a year on interest on our debt, and other than healthcare and Social Security, it's actually our largest growing federal expenditure. And in 8 years or so, it's going to be more than national defense just to pay the interest on our national debt. And that's really concerning, and that's something that should kind of set off a light bulb for a lot of people out there, I think.
And eventually this is going to lead to some sort of inflationary cycle, because the value of our dollar continues to be strained by this because of the amount of dollars that are out there.
Yeah, and we've already kind of seen a little bit of risks in that in the stock market, I think, in the last few months. There's fears over inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, interest rates will go up. We've been at such a historically low level of interest rates over the last, going on 10 years or so now. At some point, that's going to reverse. And the longer that we hold on to this massive amount of debt, it's really been proven over in other countries that it does have a drag on your economy. And it makes things more expensive to purchase. It makes your take-home pay usually lower on average than it otherwise would have been. So really, it decreases the quality of life for the average American if we continue to carry these large levels of debt.
Justin Bogie is on with us. He's Senior Policy Analyst in Fiscal Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Justin, 2001, before September 11th, up through September 10th, 2001, the big conversation in the Bush administration was Social Security reform. There was the raging debate over that he wanted and was investigating ideas regarding privatization and things like that. Obviously, we can't go put the toothpaste back in the tube, but man, that's 16 years wasted that we haven't been talking about this. That has really put us even further into desperate times, haven't we?
Yeah, that's for sure. Obviously, we had a major national event that took place, and started spending money in a lot of other areas that were warranted at the time, certainly. But I think it did detract from the conversation. If we had gotten on some type, even mild, Social Security reform back then maybe we wouldn't be talking about the trust fund going insolvent in just basically less than 20 years. But again, if we continue to delay, we're only making the problem worse. Mm-hmm. So regardless of what's happened in the past, we really need to hope to shift that conversation and get people interested in it again.
Well, that's
and try to do something.
Well, the reason I wanted to bring it up is, what are there things that they were talking about then that we can resuscitate? We see all these Broadway shows that are remakes of things that happened in years ago. Can we go back to some of the things they were talking about then and look at them as possible fixes now?
Well, yeah, I think all options should be on the table, and we've thrown out a lot of our own ideas here. People are on average living longer now than they did when this program was created. So you can always talk about raising the eligibility age a little bit. You can talk about means testing these types of programs to make sure, first and foremost, the people who can't really survive any other way are getting that money. So I think there's a lot of options on the table that should certainly be debated. I never think we should limit ourselves on policy options, regardless of who came up with them or how old they are or anything like that. We should always be open to any idea, at least to the discussion of it, and kind of go from there.
Well, let me ask you one that comes from a Virginia congressman. The proposal is that in exchange for a year of student loan debt forgiveness, you give a year of we won't tap into Social Security. And I may be using the framework slightly wrong, and the congressman's office will probably contact me and say, no, you got the numbers wrong, Joe. But it's basically an idea of using student loan forgiveness for a promise to not tap into Social Security for an extra number of years, pushing the opt-in time back. Is that, like you said, it seems like it needs to be multiple options, not just one?
Yeah, again, I don't really know anything about that specific option, but that certainly sounds like one idea that could be talked about. Another idea would be to give people that the citizens more control over their retirement accounts. Maybe look at going to some type of private account so that the taxpayer who's paying into the system can decide how they want that money invested and what they think is going to be the best return on it. So, again, I think we should be open to all options and certainly look at all angles.
That was certainly President Bush's plan back in 2001. What about the idea that there's a means test? And again, this is one of those throw grandma from the train kind of things. I can hear the bumper sticker hashtag rhetoric that'll come from it. But to say to somebody, a George Soros who's going to start collecting, or probably already has started collecting Social Security, does he really need that Social Security money? And then does that just move it into a place where it's just a tax at that point?
Yeah, I think that's something you have to be careful of. You don't want to be paying a tax just for the sake of paying a tax. But generally, people with higher incomes obviously have other forms of retirement income, and if the option is that nobody is going to have Social Security or at certainly a lot lower levels than they expected to have it, then maybe that's something we still need to look at. I think it should certainly be an option, but there is certainly that kind of tension there between I'm paying tax for this and I should get something for it versus whether I really need it or not.
I've even heard folks on the left saying to make it more of like an income tax where the more you make, the more you pay. Those are some of my Democrat friends have promoted that idea that, oh, well, if your income goes up, you pay more income tax. Why don't you pay more Social Security tax and kick in more money there? And I guess there are a million different ideas from the left and the right. But the point is that in 10 years, entitlements are going to be the entirety of what we currently are collecting in taxes, isn't it, Justin?
Right. Yeah, we're well on pace for entitlements to actually exceed all of their federal spending, entitlements plus debt. And at that point, we're just going to be continuing to build on these $1 trillion+ deficits and adding more debt. And the faster this problem kind of accelerates, the closer we get to that breaking point where eventually, something is going to have to give. There's going to be a fiscal crisis. There's going to be some kind of event that makes lawmakers take action. And like I kind of alluded to earlier, the longer you wait, then kind of the more dire those reactions are. We're going to be talking about having large tax increases to everybody. So, regardless of if you're rich or poor or otherwise probably, or you're going to be looking at massive cuts to government programs. So really there's no good outcome.
What about the demographics of it? We're talking about the baby boomers really being the driver of so much of this, all getting into the retirement land now, and in some cases being in retirement for 20, 25 years post their work life. But when they begin passing away, demographically, we're looking at much smaller population cells. Does that relieve some of the pressure without sounding ghoulish or Walking Dead kind of thing? Is that, if the demographics shift and the population changes, do we see that taking some of the pressure off, Justin?
I'm not really sure on Social Security over the long term. I haven't looked at that data lately. But on healthcare, I don't think that's the case at all, just because the other costs, kind of regardless of how many people are going into the healthcare system, those costs are just rising so much that they're still going to be very high and consume, a large proportion of the federal budget, even after, some of those people kind of go off of the Medicare rolls.
Do you see people there with leadership in this that we can throw our full-throated support to? Are there members of the House and Senate or even members of the swamp creatures, regulators that are saying this, that we can say, hey, we believe in this guy, listen to this gal, whatever it may be, Justin?
Not to be cynical, but I don't think there is a lot of leadership out there on this right now. And you kind of mentioned the Tea Party movement back in 2010. That's what got some of these budget controls in place. The Budget Control Act of 2011, kind of most notably, that was supposed to start curbing spending and limiting how much money we spend every year. And unfortunately, a lot of those voices that were out there then seem to have gone away. But I did read something interesting just before I came on with you. Is a new poll came out this morning from the Peterson Foundation saying that 78% of Americans think that the national debt should be one of top three priorities for Congress to deal with the rest of this year. So I think maybe more people are starting to take attention out there now, which if they start putting more pressure on their congressman, their senator, then that could certainly change the dynamic. There's nothing that gets them more motivated than votes and poor results in elections and those kind of things. So I think there's some hope there.
Yeah, I think the genius of our founders putting these Congress people up for re-election every couple of years wasn't such a bad idea. Justin Bogie, thank you so much for joining us this week, and you can read his stuff at heritage.org, and I presume the Daily Caller will pick up some of your stuff as well?
DailySignal.com.
Daily Signal, I'm sorry. Wrong website. But, DailySignal.com as well. Justin, thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening as well, wherever you may be, and joining us over the weekend. Thank you for tuning in, and, of course, going to tertiumquids.org for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Until next weekend, so long, and thanks for all the fish.